Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Tuesday, January the 14th, 2025. Today I want to talk a little bit about our old friend Meghan Markle. So she has been in the news quite a lot because of her Netflix series With Love, Meghan. I mean, it's amazing. On YouTube, there are just so many videos criticizing her, saying how awful this series is going to be, even though there's just been a trailer. I mean, I looked at the trailer. It doesn't look particularly original. Maybe at times Meghan has an issue with originality. That in itself might be of astrological interest. But the key point about this series is that it was going to be shown starting on January the 15th, and now it's been moved back to March the 4th. And of course, that has astrological implications. And so is it better to show this thing on March the 4th than January the 15th? And this is a real astrological issue, because in astrology there is something called elections, not elections as in voting for things, but electing the right time to start a project, for example. And the question is, from an astrological point of view, was it a good idea to move With Love, Meghan to March the 4th? I mean, I suppose the argument was that with the Los Angeles fires, that's not where the focus should be, and she wanted it moved to March the 4th, and has been moved to March the 4th. So is this going to make a difference? I mean, it's just one thing to look at, but I would argue, just from an astrological perspective, that it was probably a good idea to move it to March the 4th, because I think that astrologically the situation is better on March the 4th. And so that's something I'll be looking at, and I'll be having another look at Meghan's horoscope. Another thing I want to talk about a little bit is Mars, because today Mars is actually strongly placed. I'm not saying it is in a strong position. It's strongly placed as in it's making a lot of connections. And I will be talking about that throughout this video. Anyway, let me now look at what is happening today astrologically, and also from a perspective of the I Ching. And today is, of course, Tuesday, January the 14th. Now, if you happen to like this video, of course, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I would be extremely grateful if you were to subscribe. I don't think it costs you anything, but apparently it does make a difference to the channel. Anyway, let's look at what is happening today. So let's look at the chart. Actually, that's a chart of England. I was going to talk about England today, but I think I might talk about England tomorrow. I thought it might be better to get Meghan out of the way today, and England's not going away anytime soon. So here is the positions of the planets for today at noon, set for New York on January the 14th. And so you can see that the moon is in early Leo. The moon is at 4 degrees Leo. So we have the moon moving into a fire sign. And that may be something of a relief. There aren't any other planets in fire signs, and perhaps some of us might have been feeling that things had been a little too quiet. There wasn't that spark. We needed to get things moving, and with moon in Leo, we might get that spark. Also, with a moon in Leo, that is a reminder that the immediate power of the full moon is now over. Because while the moon was in Cancer, we had the sun in Capricorn, but now that the moon is in Leo, the moon is no longer in the opposite sign to the sun. So that might make things a little bit easier. Though the moon in Leo, it's not a great placement, moon in Leo. I mean, I know that some of you, 1 in 12 people watching, all things being equal, will have their moon in Leo. But there can be a few issues with the moon in this sign. For one thing, the moon does not have any dignity in Leo. And so the moon feels a little bit weak in this sign. It's very different from with the sun in Leo. I mean, the sun rules Leo, but moon in Leo sometimes feels a bit fragile and wants attention, but can't always get that attention and might feel a little bit overwhelmed. I mean, that is because the moon is sort of a passive, feminine planet, and in a fire sign like Leo, that just can be a bit too much. So that's one thing going on. We've got the moon moving into Leo. We also have Mars semi-square Jupiter, and this Mars semi-square Jupiter has been building up over the last few days. I've already talked about it quite a lot. I'm going to talk about it again at the end of the video before I look at Meghan, because it's not just that Mars is semi-square Jupiter. Mars is making a sesquiquadrate to Venus, and there's a moon conjunct Mars as well. So did I say, well, right at the beginning of the day we've got moon conjunct Mars, but Venus is sesquiquadrate Mars at a time when Jupiter is square, when Venus is square Jupiter. So we've got Mars, Jupiter and Venus are all very connected with one another. And yes, later in the video I'll be looking at those three planets in detail. But, with Mars semi-square Jupiter, and it's almost triggered by the fact that we've got Venus sesquiquadrate Mars and Venus square Jupiter. It's going to be, I think, quite a hectic day. Quite a tense day, I think, as well. And we also have Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus. Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus, 135 degrees from Uranus. There's just that tension. You can see the aspect here. Mercury at 9 degrees Capricorn, sesquiquadrate Uranus at 23 Taurus. That Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus will be more at the beginning of the day, but Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus could create some kind of agitation, especially sort of on a mental level, our mind moving in different ways and having to sort of talk about what's on our mind, and in quite a nervous, tense way. So, yes, there is a lot going on. By the way, the moon moves into Leo at 9:12 a.m. London time. So if you're in the Americas, moon is in Leo all day. I mean, the moon makes a change in the middle of the night. If you're in Europe, most of the day, Europe, Africa, most of the day, the moon is in Leo. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, then the moon is not going to go to Leo until this evening. So, talking about Australia, if we look at the positions of a planet set for Sydney rather than New York at midday, you can see that the moon is not at 4 degrees Leo; it's at 25 degrees Cancer. So if you're in Australia, it may be Australia or New Zealand or Eastern Asia, it might be a slightly different day. Moon will be in Cancer for most of the day, perhaps even all the day, if it's perhaps in New Zealand. And that means that there is a certain emphasis, continued emphasis on the emotional side of things. There isn't much fire. In fact, there isn't any fire until late in the evening, and the moon is making a conjunction to Mars. So maybe in some respects, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, it could be a more complicated day. Less to be said, but more to brood about, perhaps, with the moon making that conjunction to Mars. From a heliocentric perspective, here it is. Here is the positions of the planets when we put the Sun at the centre of the solar system, and as I've been saying recently, we have had this build up to an Earth conjunctions with Mars, and so the Earth conjunction with Mars is now getting pretty close. And tomorrow the Earth will be conjunct Mars, but we are, I think, going to be really feeling it. And it also comes at a time when Mars is sextile Uranus. You can see Mars is getting ready to make that sextile. So this aspect, or these two aspects, are not exact until tomorrow, but I think they're pretty exact. So the heliocentric chart kind of reinforces the geocentric chart. Geocentrically, we've got Mars, semi-square Jupiter. Heliocentrically, we've got Mars moving to a sextile with Uranus. So the tension levels are starting to rise, and things can happen. And that Mars sextile Uranus, it might sound like a good aspect, Mars sextile Uranus, but heliocentrically, I sometimes think with the heliocentric chart that it's kind of blind to the nature of the aspect. It doesn't matter. The point is, these two planets are in aspect. We've got a Mars-Uranus contact. We've got an Earth-Mars contact. We've got an Earth-Uranus contact. And that is, I think, going to stir things up. So that's it. That's the heliocentric view. And now I want to consider things from the perspective of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Tuesday, January the 14th, 2025. Aries. The moon is changing sign. It's moving from Cancer to Leo. And from your perspective, I would have said that is a good thing. With the moon in Cancer, you might have felt a little more introspective than usual. You might have also felt that a lot of your energies were going, if you like, down rather than up. You are having to worry about perhaps your home or your family, or maybe some set of private concerns. And also, Mars is in Cancer as well. Mars will be in Cancer for some time. I think Mars moves into Leo, is it in April, something like that? But so the next couple of months, you've got the Mars in Cancer. And so having Moon in Cancer as well was just a bit too much of a good thing. And so you could have been focusing on things that you probably didn't really want to focus on. And at the same time, when dealing with the world at large, you just might have felt somewhat uncomfortable. So with the moon moving into Leo, it's kind of a breath of fresh air. You feel you've sort of got more space, and you can express yourself more. And of course, with moon moving into Leo, moon is in a fire sign, and Aries is a fire sign, and so that allows you to express yourself more, be yourself. I mean, it is going to take a little bit of time. I mean, the moon moves into Leo, but then you could say, well, what does it do then? Well, the moon moves into Leo, then it makes an opposition to Pluto. So that's the first thing you have to deal with. And I suppose moon opposition Pluto is about defining who you are, and defining your area of interest, defining your space, and I suppose also defining your power, because power is important with moon opposition Pluto. And so the first thing you have to do with moon in Leo is perhaps decide where you want to focus your fire, and perhaps you do need to be focused to begin with. The moon is a fixed sign. Now, as far as how much energy you have. I mean, you do have an increased amount of energy now because Mars is semi-square Jupiter. So with Mars semi-square Jupiter, there could be a tendency on your part to really throw your energy around. You feel you've got so much of it, but where are you going to put it? I'm hoping that the Moon opposition Pluto is going to perhaps allow you to focus this energy onto something useful, but there is some danger that it gets scattered. And additionally, there is a sesquiquadrate between Venus and Mars. So that Venus-Mars sesquiquadrate is possibly saying something about relationships. Venus and Mars are the natural pair, and they do have a strong connection with one-to-one relationships, and they're in sesquiquadrate. So if they're in sesquiquadrate aspect, that might indicate that you and other people are not entirely on the same wavelength. Now, with Moon moving into Leo, in a way, I think you are feeling more of an extrovert, more sociable, but it really should be on your terms. And if you spend a lot of time with people, you might find that you get frustrated. I mean, perhaps that just means that you need to decide what's important and make choices, but you shouldn't make assumptions that relationships are going to run smoothly today. And also, don't be surprised if other people overreact, because Mars is making a semi-square to Jupiter and Venus is making a square to Jupiter. So you and other people might be tempted to overdo it, take something too far. So perhaps you shouldn't put yourself in a situation where that kind of excessive behavior is a possibility. Taurus. Today there is a square aspect between Venus and Jupiter. And this Venus-Jupiter aspect could encourage a certain excessiveness. So when you've got Venus and Jupiter in aspect to each other, you might think that it's quite nice because Venus is your ruler, and Venus is a benefic. Jupiter is a benefic also. So there could be a certain optimism there, and it might work well. But there are a few problems. I mean, it is a square after all. And additionally, when you've got Venus and Jupiter coming together, there's a certain danger of excessiveness, and perhaps this excessiveness might have a financial dimension, could be something emotionally, or it could just be other people just getting distracted. Venus wants to see the best in things, wants to see the best in people, wants to listen to what people have to say. If other people make suggestions, Venus square Jupiter, who are you to turn these suggestions down? So there are possibilities there for taking things too far. And so with Venus square Jupiter, I think a certain amount of self-discipline could actually be very important. Though I don't want to be completely down on the Venus square Jupiter aspect. Yeah, it is about optimism and seeing the best in things and the best in people, and that can be great, just provided you don't take things too far. Also, Jupiter is moving through Gemini, and Gemini is a sign in the Taurian chart that is often connected with money. So if you've got Venus square Jupiter, it may have particular relevance to the financial dimension. And yes, it's quite possible that you might be tempted to spend too much money or buy something you don't need or indulge yourself in some way that is unnecessary. And Venus is not just making a square to Jupiter, it's also making a sesquiquadrate to Mars. And this Venus sesquiquadrate Mars may have implications for you and other people if you take the view that Venus rules Taurus, it's your ruler. Mars rules your opposite sign, which is of course Scorpio. So Venus sesquiquadrate Mars perhaps gives us the idea of you and another person not seeing eye to eye, and there just maybe a feeling of mismatch, especially on a one-to-one level, that you might have different opinions. And Mars in Cancer can be about someone who is quite opinionated. They have their own views, they want to hold on to their own views, and in a way they can be emotional and stubbornly emotional and perhaps somewhat brooding. And you'd like things to be more straightforward, but is the other person going to see things in the same way? Possibly not. So overall, I think these aspects between involving Venus and Jupiter and Venus and Mars could be a little bit problematic. So try not to take things to extremes, and it's going to be very important that you don't indulge yourself excessively. A bit of indulgence is fine. I mean, you are a Taurus after all, but just don't go too far with it. And while all this is going on, the moon is changing sign. The moon is moving from Cancer to Leo. And with the moon moving into Leo, it may be a time when you feel that it might be a good idea to in some way try to ground yourself. So there's a bit of a contrast actually between the moon moving into Leo and this Venus square Jupiter and the Venus sesquiquadrate Mars, particularly the Venus square Jupiter. Venus square Jupiter, wants to take things too far, potentially. Moon in Leo, on the other hand, is saying, well, actually, you just want a quiet life. And I think that moon in Leo is perhaps more fundamental to who you are. And so there are distractions, there are temptations to indulge, but fundamentally, I don't think that's really where you want to go. Moon in Leo is making an opposition to Pluto. And that moon in Leo making an opposition to Pluto really is saying that you're very wary of your boundaries, potentially. You don't want things intruding into your life and into your world. And so that it might be a time where you want to sort of put up some fences. So again, you can see the contradiction here. There's plenty to distract you, and perhaps there may be moments where you sort of forget your boundaries and you forget your limits, especially when you're dealing with other people. Just they're encouraging you to take things too far. But if you actually stop and think about what you want and you ignore the outside distractions, then you realize that you just want a little bit of peace. And I think that with the moon in Leo, that is something that you can find. Of course, the moon goes into Leo at different times. I think that if you're in the Americas and in Europe, the moon is in Leo right at the beginning of the day. If you're in Australia and New Zealand, it might take a bit of time for you to get into that moon in Leo energy, but it will get there in the end. Gemini, possibly the main aspect affecting you today is a sesquiquadrate between Mercury and Uranus. So Mercury is, of course, your ruler, and it says something about you and what you're trying to do and where you are at the moment. And I think at the moment, Gemini, you are trying to work out what is going on, and there's possibly quite a lot of thought, even a bit of feeling, in terms of trying to make sense of everything. And stability could be important. You don't want too much going on, because you might take the view that there's enough going on a sort of a private and a personal level. And in general, you may be a little bit more introspective than usual. And by introspective, I'm perhaps saying that you're sort of overstimulated. Life is complicated enough. So when I say overstimulated, I mean, I think there is this theory that introverts are a little bit overstimulated, and so they need to calm things down, whereas extroverts are sort of understimulated at some level, so they need extra action. Whether or not you're an extrovert or an introvert in general, maybe you've done a psychology test to work out whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. For myself, I'm an extreme introvert. I'm off the scale pretty much as far as introversion is concerned. But there are some times when you're going to be more introverted than others. And I think at the moment, with Mercury moving through Capricorn, you're possibly more introverted than usual. Though this Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus does stir things up. And it might be that you have an idea, something occurs to you, and it may be very fortunate. Or it could be a realization. You think about something, and you're thinking about it very hard, and you suddenly come to a realization. It's possibly quite a private realization, but when that realization happens, you perhaps think that really everything has changed, and once things change, it can't be put back. So you have to open yourself to that possibility of change, and perhaps sudden change, and it's all part of a process. It's a process by which you are moving from one thing to another, and at some level maybe you will sort of appreciate the variety. So that's one thing going on with Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus. It does stir things up, and it makes you realize how complicated things are, but maybe complicated in a good way, because you may see things and understand things that other people don't, and even if you don't get all the details, you understand what really and fundamentally matters. Now, there is another aspect going on which is of some note, and that is a square between Venus and Jupiter. So this Venus-Jupiter aspect will impact different people in different ways. I was just talking to Taurus about Venus square Jupiter, and I was indicating that maybe this Venus square Jupiter could represent overindulgence, just taking something too far, perhaps spending too much money. In your case, though, I think that this Venus square Jupiter is likely to be fortunate, because you've got Jupiter moving through Gemini, your sign, already, and then Venus in Pisces comes along and makes that square. So Venus in Pisces, from your perspective, is angular, and it's high profile, and it's Venus in Pisces. I mean, Venus is exalted in Pisces, and Venus in Pisces can be about you getting attention, favourable attention. It could be about your ambitions, and maybe connecting with people who are relevant to your ambitions. I understand that in some respects you are feeling quite introverted today, and you might not be in the mood for a lot of interaction, but still there are people you can meet, perhaps you can make a good impression. And Venus square Jupiter, especially in a sort of business and professional sense, you can actually come over as being a sort of larger than life person, and you can present a certain vision, and I think that people will tend to trust you by and large, perhaps because you can make them feel good about themselves. I mean, even if you have your own doubts, I think that is something you can do. You'll know what to say. You will know how to present yourself. And maybe you'll be helped by the fact that the moon is moving out of Cancer, moving into Leo. And so with moon moving into Leo, I think that is going to give a certain boost to your communication skills. It may not be easy at first, because I do think you're more introverted than usual. But, once the words start coming out, you'll get it right, and you'll get the balance right, and you will get attention. And maybe with Moon opposition Pluto, you may get quite a lot of attention. There's just something about what you say that just can't be ignored. Cancer, the moon is changing sign. It's moving out of Cancer into Leo, and so it is a bit of a change, and it may be that you have to think a little bit about your resources and what you have, and whether you've got enough when the moon moves into Leo, because moon in Leo is a sign following Cancer, and the moon, when it moves into Leo, it makes an opposition to Pluto, and that moon opposition Pluto can in certain situations be a little bit obsessive. It can be obsessive about what you have and what you don't have, and you might not want to spend too much time worrying about money, but money may still be an issue, or you at least may feel that it's an issue. And with the moon in Leo, you perhaps want to hold on to what you've got, and at the same time there may be a certain tendency to make money more important than it need be. It depends on who you are, it depends on what kind of Cancerian you are, but moon in Leo is quite a proud placement for the moon, and money and pride may have a certain connection, and so it's important to be rational, certainly when it comes to money, and not to get caught up with something financial just for the sake of being right. Might be some danger with moon opposition Pluto that you spend too much time worrying about a small amount of money. Now, a small amount of money is completely relative, so it depends. To some people, $1 is nothing. To other people, it's incredibly important. I suppose it depends where you are, what you're earning, whatever. So do try to get a perspective on it. It's about, in the end, how much money you've got. It's not about feeling good about something, or feeling proud, or feeling you're the winner. It doesn't matter. So don't exaggerate money, but you still have to regard it as being important, but just don't make it more important than it actually is. Now, one thing, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, the moon doesn't really go into Leo until the very end of the day, perhaps even into tomorrow. And so if you're in Australia or New Zealand, the main aspect today is a conjunction between the moon and Mars in Cancer in your sign. So that probably means if you're an Australasian Cancerian, you're going to be a lot more assertive, perhaps even a little bit angry today. And the financial aspect of things is probably going to be fairly irrelevant. Now, one aspect we do have, which I think is quite important for everyone, is an aspect between Venus and Jupiter. So Venus and Jupiter, for you, Cancer, is possibly about wanting to take something further, feeling that you're missing out on something, that you don't have everything you need, you don't have the inspiration you need. And it could be quite a spiritual aspect, Venus square Jupiter. And Venus is in Pisces, and Venus gives you potentially a certain comfort. You could be in a place where you are spiritually supported. And Venus in Pisces, Venus is very aesthetic, thinking about the way things look and appearances, but at the same time having a general comfort. You are in the right place, you're going in the right direction. But then Jupiter kind of upsets things a little. Jupiter may encourage you to exaggerate, or may encourage someone else to exaggerate. So in terms of spirituality and people talking about what they believe in, Venus square Jupiter may represent someone who talks too much about what they believe in. And that might not be spiritual. I mean, it could, I suppose, be political, but there's something a little bit unstructured, even lazy, about Venus square Jupiter. And one can be lazy when it comes to sort of politics and spirituality. People talking about stuff they believe in, but without any real ability to support their ideas. So that could be one way in which this aspect is manifesting. And in terms of relationships, there is a sesquiquadrate between Mercury and Uranus. Mercury is in Capricorn, your opposite sign. So Mercury represents perhaps some of the people close to you, the people you have to deal with. And Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus kind of stirs things up. And it might represent someone whose behavior might be a little bit erratic. So if you see people behaving erratically or saying erratic things, it could be disturbing, but perhaps you shouldn't take it to heart. It's just the way things are at the moment, and Mercury will move on. By tomorrow, that Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus won't exist anymore. We'll be thinking about some other aspect. So don't be put off by what people say and by what people do, and perhaps you should expect people to exaggerate. And I don't really think it's a good time for taking what anyone says at face value. Leo, the moon is moving into your sign, and I would have thought you should be quite happy to have the moon moving into Leo. It makes you more energetic, and I think it also makes you more positive, because recently we've had nothing in fire signs. We did have some planets in Sagittarius. We had the Sun in Sagittarius. We had Mercury very recently was in Sagittarius, but that's left. Sun and Mercury are both in Capricorn. So there is kind of a drought of fire. Now that doesn't sound very good, does it? Drought. You don't really think about droughts of fire. But in a way, there is a bit of a drought of fire. There has been a drought of fire. Okay, that might not seem a very appropriate thing to say if you're in Los Angeles, but having the moon moving into a fire sign, for you, Leo, and particularly as that fire sign is Leo, just makes you feel good. And it makes you feel more alive, more positive, and you have a sense of what you can do, and also perhaps what you need to fight against. Because the moon, when it moves into Leo, it does make an opposition to Pluto. So with moon opposition Pluto, you feel alive, but at the same time, you're aware of things that might be holding you back. Perhaps people holding you back. But I wouldn't worry about it too much. I mean, the key point is that the moon is in Leo, and I think in general your spirits are going to be given a boost, and everyone will pick up on your sort of renewed level of confidence. Though you still have to understand that things are not entirely simple. I mean, it's not just about you. You know, there are things going on under the surface that you barely understand. You're starting to understand it, but you're not there all the way yet. And so it's a good idea not to make assumptions about other people, for example. Don't assume that everything is simple, that you can judge people in terms of their external behavior, their words. There's possibly something going on under the surface that you don't fully get, and that might take you a bit of time to really, really understand. And also, Leo, you're not entirely 100% there. And by that I mean, in terms of consciousness, there may be times during the day when you drift a little. You think you're concentrating, you think you're present, and then all of a sudden you're somewhere else. Possibly because you're thinking about something else. Maybe you're distracted. Maybe in extreme situations you may be catapulted into an alternative dimension. I mean, I don't mean that literally in some kind of science fiction way, but it just could be that you understand the multidimensionality of the world in which we are living, and sometimes you can just drift into someplace else. And so in that case, you need to make sure that you're not engaged in sort of safety critical activities, because there may be times when your concentration is just not perfect. And so if you're doing something that requires a lot of concentration, well, make sure you really are able to give it your full concentration. And the moment you feel your mind is wandering, just stop what you're doing. Or perhaps if you're doing something that requires a lot of concentration, or you're being pressured to do something that requires this kind of concentration, you should consider postponing it, doing it different date, different time. That might actually be a good idea. So it's a day that is going to be maybe somewhat transitional, especially if you're in Asia or Australia, New Zealand. I've talked about the moon being in Leo as if it's a present reality. If you're in Australia and New Zealand, actually the moon is moving through Cancer most of the day, and the moon doesn't actually move into Leo until very late in the day. And so a lot of what I've been saying in terms of you enjoying the moon being in Leo, that may be more about tomorrow. But even in the Americas and Europe, where you have the moon moving into Leo in the morning, the moon still makes that opposition to Pluto, and the moon doesn't really get going in Leo, doesn't really start delivering results until tomorrow, because tomorrow the moon makes a sextile to Jupiter, and that is something that we can regard as a result. But for the moment, it should perhaps be a time for you to just try to understand what is happening. You have more energy at your disposal, that is true. You are feeling more positive, but it is just a beginning, so don't be in too much of a rush. Virgo, there are things happening today which are likely to have an impact on you. I mean, for a start, we've got Mercury, your ruler, making a sesquiquadrate to Uranus. And that Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus could really stir you up in a mental and a creative way. I think in most cases the Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus is going to work in your favour, but at times it could be a little bit stressful, particularly if you've already made up your mind about something and you think everything is clear. Then Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus might present you with new information that you're not entirely happy about. But, why aren't you happy about something new? You could be unhappy about it because it's a bother. I mean, if you have sorted everything out and you're ready to go, then Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus comes along and says, well, no, actually, you've forgotten something, and there's something you hadn't considered, and you might have to change your plans a little bit. And yeah, that is annoying, but knowledge is good, even if the knowledge isn't to your liking. So don't disregard something new, even if you find it really annoying, tedious, and disruptive. And disruptive perhaps might be the key word here with Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus. And, Uranus wants you to be successful. Uranus wants you to make the most of everything you've got. Uranus is on your side. Just remember that. But Uranus just wants you to consider things. Uranus wants you to consider everything. And so if you do get an inspiration, if you do get new information, don't just turn your back on it because it's too complicated. I think you just need to very much accept it and see this as a possibility, and the universe, stepping in to help you out to maximize your potential. Now, there are other things going on. There is a square aspect between Venus and Jupiter. This Venus-Jupiter square may also be, to an extent, about some kind of distraction. It is a square. Jupiter is in Gemini. Jupiter is under a little bit of pressure in Gemini. Jupiter is retrograde, and it's kind of peregrine. Jupiter is at midnight New York time is at 12 degrees Gemini, going retrograde, and so Jupiter is moving backwards into its own term. So Jupiter is getting some dignity which it didn't have before. In a way, Jupiter has reached its peak weakness and is now slowly starting to pull itself out of the abyss. I won't say the abyss, that's a bit extreme, but how is this relevant to Venus square Jupiter? Well, Jupiter being in Gemini does say something about what you're trying to achieve and some of your ambitions. And I think that, since last year, since the late spring of last year, you have, in your own way, been quite ambitious, and it hasn't always been easy. And this Venus square Jupiter on the surface at least seems to be a disruptor, having perhaps to deal with pressure from other people, maybe having to deal with other people's priority, dealing with people who are perhaps more emotional than you perhaps like them to be, and that seems to be getting in the way of things. And so Virgos, you might actually have some doubts about whether you're doing the right thing, whether you're going in the right direction, and other people's behavior and reactions might reinforce these doubts. But as I have just said, Jupiter is moving into its own term. Jupiter is no longer peregrine, and it's no longer wandering. There is a chance now to get some more focus. That focus which has perhaps been lost maybe over the last couple of weeks, perhaps since Mercury moved into Capricorn, because when Mercury moved into Capricorn, Jupiter no longer had any dignity. So if you get bothered, if you get disturbed, don't take this as a negative. And so it may actually be working in a similar way to that Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus. Mercury sesquiquadrate Uranus represented perhaps something you didn't want to hear. Venus square Jupiter may represent a person who you don't really want to take into account. But in both cases, if you take into account this disturbance or this distraction or this new piece of information, you will actually be strengthening yourself, even though it might not seem like it at the time. Libra, one of the main aspects today is a square aspect between Venus and Jupiter. And, this Venus-Jupiter aspect takes place possibly towards the end of the day, but I think you're going to feel it all day long. And Venus represents you, because Venus rules Libra, and it represents you trying to perhaps sort things out, sort out your life, trying to make sure everything is in order. And Jupiter comes along and presents you with something else. And it is a square, so there is a certain amount of tension there. And this Venus square Jupiter can manifest in different ways depending on what kind of person you are. It can actually be, this Venus square Jupiter, it can actually be quite an indulgent aspect. It can even be lazy. I mean, there is a relationship between Jupiter and laziness, or doing something just because you enjoy it, because it's fun, but it's not necessarily very useful. And that means there is a possibility today that time goes quickly. You waste a lot of time because you can't think of anything better to do. I mean, there are better things to do, but you get distracted, and your attempts to make sure that everything is in order kind of don't work out. Now, it may be, Libra, that you actually feel that you want to be distracted. And so, provided that you put some limits on things, then you could say, well, go ahead. Especially as Moon is in Leo. And Moon is in Leo, that's going to be more of a feature if you're in America and Europe. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, Moon in Leo is more about tomorrow. But with the Moon in Leo, that can be quite sociable, and there could be people to meet, people to talk to with Venus square Jupiter, and it could just take a lot of time, could dominate your day even. And then you have to think, well, what actually are you going to achieve? What actually can you achieve? And It may be that you end up not achieving very much. Is that a problem? Well, it needn't be a problem. You may just feel that you need a break. Though, Libra, make sure that your own routines are not completely disrupted. You might abandon something that you've been trying to get together. You get distracted, you abandon it, and you just can't get it together again. It just doesn't come back. So if you are completely undisciplined and you just allow everyone to just grab your attention, then you could have a completely unproductive day. So perhaps at the beginning of the day, you need to tell yourself what needs to be done, and not allow these external forces to completely mess you up, even if at some level you want them to mess you up. And Venus is not just making a square to Jupiter. Venus is also making a sesquiquadrate to Mars. And this sesquiquadrate between Venus and Mars could have some relevance for relationships. Now, sesquiquadrate, it's a difficult aspect, 135-degree aspect, 3/8 of the circle. And it may be that you and another person have different priorities. You don't quite understand each other. And it's not necessarily the case that you're going to have a major disagreement, but there's going to be an uneasiness there. And you must therefore decide how best to deal with it. Sometimes a disagreement, a difference of opinion, can be dynamic. It can be challenging, but it may be an opportunity for two people to express their views and to in some way synthesize it and to come to some kind of solution. So that is quite constructive. But Venus sesquiquadrate Mars just could be about a person that you just don't get on with, and you can't get on with them, and there's nothing constructive about the relationship. Now, this Venus sesquiquadrate Mars could just be about relationships, partners, spouses, people you have to interact with every day. Could also be about your work and what you're trying to achieve in life. And perhaps in that sense, this Venus sesquiquadrate Mars could be dynamic and very useful. And it may be about someone telling you things in maybe quite an assertive way that you don't want to hear, someone making suggestions, even someone telling you to get your act together. It depends on the situation. Just because you are criticized doesn't mean that you should take offense. It may well be that this criticism is constructive, even if it's not meant well. Sometimes people try to tear people down, people tear each other down by making criticisms for the sake of it, and they're not trying to be helpful, but inadvertently they can be helpful. They may be making a valid point. So if you do feel that you're being criticized, or someone is making suggestions, whether they're constructive suggestions or just suggestions which are there just to undermine you, it doesn't matter. It's not about your ego, it's about you developing as a person. And I think in certain cases you can benefit from other people's feedback. Scorpio. I have a picture of Mars top right. The reason Mars is there, the red planet, is because, as far as I'm concerned, Mars at the moment is powerfully configured. I mean, it's not that Mars is in is in a good position or necessarily in a good position. I mean, Mars is going retrograde. It is in Cancer. Mars Mars's position in Cancer is somewhat mixed. It's fallen in Cancer. I mean, it rules. It's exalted in Capricorn, so it's fallen in Cancer. But on the other hand, Mars is in a water sign, and Mars rules the water sign, so it's not the end of the world, Mars being in Cancer. But what matters about Mars at the moment, Scorpio, is that it is semi-square Jupiter, and it is also sesquiquadrate Venus. So that is very, very dynamic. And so with Mars semi-square Jupiter, I mean, I have been mentioning this aspect, but it is challenging you to make the absolute most of what you've got, to really push yourself. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. There is some danger, Scorpio, that you just take things too far. You have a lot of power and a lot of energy, and you just don't know where to put it. And so that could be a problem. You could find that you put too much energy into things which don't really require any energy, or I don't know, you might cause an accident, or there might be a mishap because you overdo something. So with Mars semi-square Jupiter, very important not to overdo it. Give something as much energy as is needed, but don't give it too much energy, because if you do, you could get yourself into a difficult situation. And Venus makes a sesquiquadrate to Mars, and this Venus sesquiquadrate Mars, you could say that it just energizes the Mars semi-square Jupiter. You could say, well, Mars semi-square Jupiter is the main aspect, and Venus is just acting as an intensifier. So it's just more of the same. Though I think with this Venus, it's perhaps encouraging you to provide a bit of a show. It's not enough perhaps just to put a lot of energy into something. You want to get attention. You want to be recognized for what you're doing. And you want to show that you're able to do something not just well, but also to do it in a way that is aesthetically pleasing, and it's also very creative, and it might be exaggeratedly creative, but that's kind of a way you want to do it, and that might be how Venus is working. And Venus is in Pisces. It's in a water sign. It's in a favorable part of your chart, a chart connected with your fundamental skills, abilities, talents, and so that Venus can potentially give you a boost, but it's hard work. I mean, it's not always going to be easy, and it might just be somewhat clumsy. And in this light, you need to think about how you're interacting with other people. So Venus-Mars contacts are often about relationships, and they're about attractiveness, and not just attractiveness, they're also about putting people off. So you behave in the wrong way, and you can put people off. There's something about you, if you were to just be yourself, that some people might just back away from. That's the nature of Venus sesquiquadrate Mars. So Scorpio, be very aware of what kind of impact you're having on other people. It may be quite an extreme impact, and so maybe in certain situations, Scorpio, you should kind of moderate yourself and focus on what might make people happy and comfortable. It's not all about you. And Venus sesquiquadrate Mars, it can be very charismatic, but you've got to get it right. And charisma can often flip into something else. I don't know what is the opposite of charisma. I'm not going to put a word to it. I can think of some words which are the opposite of charisma, but yeah, probably not very nice words. But you can get an idea. You don't want to have an anti-charisma, putting people off. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm just saying that it could happen if you're not careful, Scorpio. One other thing I should mention is the fact that the moon is changing sign from Cancer into Leo. And with the moon moving into Leo, making an opposition to Pluto, this makes you quite ambitious, and you do want to have an impact. I think that's very important at the moment, and I think that just reinforces what I was saying with these aspects, Mars semi-squared Jupiter, Venus sesquiquadrate Mars, this moon moving into Leo. Okay, happens for most of us this morning, but if you're in Australia or New Zealand, it happens very late in the day, and you might not feel it until tomorrow. But with the moon moving into Leo, Scorpio, it is a time where you can get noticed, but you shouldn't take it for granted. You have to make sure that you're noticed in the right way. But once you are noticed and you get it right, people will take you seriously, and you can have a big influence. Sagittarius. Sagittarius, we have a couple of aspects involving Jupiter which need to be talked about. We also have Jupiter at 12 degrees Gemini. And that is actually important, 12 degrees Gemini, because 12 degrees Gemini is a border. It's the border of the terms, the Egyptian terms, to be precise. So the terms are a way of dividing up the zodiac. Not a simple way like with the signs, but the terms divide up the different signs into sections with different rulerships. And Jupiter rules the section of Gemini between 6 Gemini and 6 and 12 of the sign of the sign. And so Jupiter very recently has been peregrine. It's had no dignity whatsoever. And maybe you've been feeling this. Jupiter has been in Gemini, the sign of its detriment. It's been retrograde. And at times you may have been struggling because of this. But now Jupiter is retrograding into its own terms. So Jupiter is suddenly getting dignity. Now, to give you an idea about dignity in some kind of numerical way, if a planet is in its own sign using William Lilly's point system, it gets +5. If it's in its exaltation, for example, Jupiter in Cancer, it gets +4. If it's in its own term, it gets +2. So it's not as dramatic as being in its own sign or in its exaltation, but still, it does give you dignity. So today you are gaining dignity, perhaps a dignity by dignity I'm talking about in a technical term. I'm not talking about dignity in the way we normally see dignity, but you are becoming stronger. And maybe if things have been difficult recently, you can start to actually see the light at the end of the tunnel. Jupiter is not going to get any weaker now. Jupiter is about to go direct. I think it goes direct on February the 4th. So don't worry. Looking at things just from the perspective of your ruler, Jupiter, things are on the up now. And Jupiter does get some aspects. It gets a semisquare of Mars and a square of Jupiter. So Jupiter semisquare Mars, this aspect has been around for a bit of time, and I think you've already been feeling it to an extent. and it is exact today. Okay, it could have been exact yesterday if you're in the Americas. But Mars is really stirring things up, and it is making you feel that you want to do something. You want to make something happen. And it might be a little bit frustrating, but you might feel that you have no choice, that you just have to do something. But don't feel that you have to act immediately. Remember what I just said about Jupiter moving retrograde into its own terms. You don't have to immediately respond to that. You can wait to see how things pan out, get an idea of how things are working and what is the right thing to do. But still, that Mars semi-square Jupiter reminds you that you are able to make things happen. You can certainly make things happen, but don't rush it. I mean, that is important. Just know that things are starting to get better, and Venus is also making a square to Jupiter, and this Venus square Jupiter is a somewhat mixed aspect. I think it can be a good aspect provided you handle it correctly. Venus is in Pisces, it is exalted in Pisces. And so you could say that Venus square Jupiter challenges you to make yourself feel comfortable. That's perhaps a challenge. If you can make yourself feel comfortable and just feel that you're in the right place, that there's nothing much that you have to strive for right now, then in a way you've made that square work for you. On the other hand, Venus square Jupiter can encourage impulsive behavior. It can encourage extravagance, and so you might feel that you need to do something extravagant, some extravagant gesture. It might be about spending money or buying some expensive, beautiful object, or it seems beautiful at the time. It probably won't look very beautiful once you actually have a close look at it. When you look at your credit card bill, for example. So it's not actually a good time for buying beautiful objects, but that would be the wrong way to use Venus square Jupiter. However you're feeling at the moment, you can't solve the problem through indulgence, through extravagance. It comes through just finding a natural sense of ease. And that is happening. As I've said, Jupiter is moving into its term. And when you're dealing with these dignities like exaltation and sign and what else, term, face, whatever, they are about your home in a symbolic way. Clearly, if you have a planet in its own sign, is completely at home. A planet in its term, which is what's happening to Jupiter moving backwards into its own term. A planet into its own term, it's not feeling 100% at home. That's true, but it can feel comfortable enough, and that's something that over the next couple of days, as you'll start to realize that things aren't actually quite so bad. I mean, things aren't bad at all, really. I mean, a lot of it is, of course, in the mind, and we also have the moon moving out of Cancer into Leo. For most of us, that sign change happens today. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, it might be more about tomorrow. But with the moon moving into Leo, into a fire sign, that's going to make things a whole lot better. I mean, with the moon in Cancer, you're perhaps thinking too much, worrying too much. It was connected also with that full moon, moon in Cancer, opposition of a sun in Capricorn. There may have been things bothering you, whether it was financial or something to do with your emotions. But with the moon moving into Leo, that gives you more freedom, gives you more perspective, and you can now see what is possible, or at least you will start to see what's possible over the next couple of days. So Sagittarius, I know a lot of what I said might have sounded a little bit negative, but I think my broad message is that things are actually getting better. Capricorn, at the moment you feel that some things have just become a little bit too much. You get the picture. You've understood something. You've completely understood it. And now you just want to break from it all. I mean, you don't need to know any more. And that might be your view. But there are still things to be understood, things to be learnt, and your mind is actually pretty active, and you're picking things up and you're inspired. You might actually think that you have sorted things out. You've understood it, you've got it. And then something else happens. You see something else, and you keep seeing something else, and you keep having to adjust. And that might be a bit annoying for you, particularly if you're trying to make plans, you're trying to organize yourself. So Capricorn, don't assume that you've got 100% of a picture. At this stage, you've probably got about 90% of the picture, but there may still be a few more things which have to be understood. But don't worry. I think that you are very much getting there, and you don't have to be quite so concerned about, for example, what other people are saying, what other people are doing. The moon is moving out of Cancer into Leo, and so with the moon moving out of Cancer into Leo, that probably gives you a greater sense of independence. You don't have to worry so much about outside pressure from particular people, and you've got the message. You understand who you're dealing with. You understand what impact certain people have on you. And now with the moon in Leo, you can start to work it through. And also the moon in Leo is making an opposition to Pluto. Now that moon opposition Pluto may be more of a feature of tomorrow than today if you're in Australia or New Zealand, but that moon opposition Pluto, it could relate to something of a financial nature. With Pluto in Aquarius, money does matter. You seem to kind of know that money matters. I mean, Capricorns always know that money matters, but with Pluto in Aquarius, it's particularly intense. Pluto went into Aquarius for the final time quite recently, I think November the 17th. And so with moon opposition Pluto, that's a reminder that something has changed, that in some ways your attitude to money has changed, and you're sort of clearer about what you want and also what you don't like, and about control and financial control with that moon opposition Pluto. That is something that is perhaps going to become increasingly important to you. But that is a wider trend of Pluto moving into Aquarius, which, as I said, that moon opposition Pluto just reminds you of this. Now, the Sun is now at around 24, 25 Aquarius. That is, 24, 25 Capricorn. That is a reminder that there is now 5 days left of the sun being in your sign. So it may be a time when you need to start to think about, what still needs to be done. I think I think you can look at things from a half decan. So when the sun hits 25 Aquarius, a decan is 10 degrees. So when you hit 25 degrees, you've only got half a decan left, that being 5 degrees, to resolve something, to sort something out. And perhaps you should be preparing for some kind of confrontation. It needn't be a confrontation with another person, but it might be a confrontation with an organization. That's possible. But the sun is moving to an opposition of Mars. And in a couple of days' time, I think 2 days' time, the sun will be exactly opposition Mars. And this sun opposition Mars will be across the main axis of your chart. And I suspect, Capricorn, you're already starting to feel this opposition. You're feeling a tension here. And you may want to start preparing for it. And you can prepare for it in different ways. You can make sure you're clear of your facts. You can prepare yourself. You can make sure that you're ready for the battle. Alternatively, it just may be that you can see a confrontation coming up with another person and you don't feel you want to involve yourself with it. So if you're trying to avoid a confrontation, then you probably need to act now rather than just wait for the sun opposition Mars to actually come about. And we get two significators of two people coming together, for better or for worse. It's not just the fact that we've got sun opposition Mars. We've also got Venus making a conjunction to Saturn. So that Venus conjunct Saturn is you. So Venus can be someone coming towards you. Sun opposition Mars, another significator of you and someone else, or some situation. Again, it may not be a person. And so Capricorn, perhaps you need to try to work out what it is and work out how you want to respond. There isn't a right way to respond, certainly not a right way to respond, but I can tell you what to do. But all I can say is it's something that perhaps you should be preparing for. Aquarius. I'm not convinced, Aquarius, that it's going to be a completely spectacular day, for better or for worse. There is a lot going on astrologically, but a lot of this astrological activity doesn't impact you directly. So it could be a day when you can just watch. People talk about popcorn. You can eat popcorn and watch what's going on as a spectator. So that is certainly a possibility. Though I'm not saying that it's going to be a completely empty day. You are, in your own way, I think, quite inspired, and you're going to have plenty of ideas. And it just may be, Aquarius, that while you're watching things, you notice something that is important to you. And so it's important, Aquarius, that you really do keep in touch with what's going on, that you don't ignore it. In your community, if you're going for a walk, just look at what's happening, take an interest in what other people are doing. You might feel that it's a little bit trivial, but you might learn something. And at the same time, you might be inspired. You might see connections happening around you, which you could potentially benefit from. Also, we have the moon moving from Cancer to Leo. Okay, we've got the moon moving into Leo. It may happen today if you're in America or Europe. It's more about late this evening tomorrow if you're in Australia or New Zealand. So you could say moon moving into Leo for Aquarians is important because Leo is your opposite sign. On the other hand, the moon moves into Leo every month, so it's not exactly an exceptional thing. Though, when the moon moves into Leo, it does make an opposition to Pluto. And so that with that moon opposition feel, it might be that you do have a certain feeling that there is an issue of who controls what, who's in charge, who's making the decisions. But going back to what I was saying about you being an observer, if you are an observer, and if you are just watching what people do, you don't actually have to be in control. You can learn from people, but you don't actually have to be telling people what to do. And I do actually think that is important. You should avoid giving orders, making suggestions, because by giving orders, making suggestions, you could be changing things, but are you changing things in a way that is helpful? And also you'd be interfering, and it may be a time, in fact I think it probably is a time, when you should just allow things to play out. Well, unless of course you see something disastrous about to happen, when of course in that case it would be necessary to intervene. But at the moment I don't actually think it's necessary. You can still think about the immediate future. You can sort of consider how things might develop. For example, there is a conjunction between Venus and Saturn. Venus is at around 12 Pisces, Saturn is 15, 16 Pisces. So at the end of a week, that Venus conjunct Saturn will be exact. And yes, that is going to have implications for you because Saturn is your ruler. And Venus may represent someone who is coming your way. Venus might actually also represent a financial opportunity. But it's not about today. It's about later in the week. So don't try to force things. Don't try to make things happen more quickly than they should do. And I think if you take that approach by not interfering, you will find also that other people are not messing you around. So if you are the observer, other people are not going to try to draw you into their own dramas. And so that also gives you a certain sense of independence. And of course, independence is a word that is very important for many Aquarians. And so if you leave other people alone, they'll leave you alone. And the moment you try to interfere in what they're doing, they'll start to try to interfere with what you're doing. So in a sense, you reap what you sow. And if you sow nothing, then you reap nothing. And right now, I think that's probably the best state to be. Things will change over the course of a week, though. Pisces. The moon is moving from Cancer to Leo. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, the moon will be in Cancer pretty much all day. If you're elsewhere, then you're going to feel the impact of moon being in Leo. So it might then be that the Australian or the New Zealand Pisces is going to have a slightly different experience than the Piscean in Europe or America or Africa. So if you're in Australia or New Zealand, the moon, as it continues through late Cancer, it's going to focus on you, and there are things that you are going to take very seriously because you feel that they are fundamental to you, but the moon is making a conjunction to Mars. So there may be a bit of a struggle there to maintain your independence, and you may feel that there's something you really do need to finish off, and that Moon-Mars conjunction is perhaps going to make you quite aggressive about it, and also you're going to be still under the immediate impact of the full moon, because the moon is going to be in Cancer, the sun is obviously still in Capricorn, so there is a sense of a struggle. I think if you are in other parts of the world, if you're in the Americas, if you're in Europe, I think it's going to be different. The moon will be in Leo, and so perhaps that's a quieter energy, because the moon is separate. The moon is separating from Mars. The full moon isn't quite so immediately powerful, and there may be a chance to get some perspective on things and be able to get yourself together in your own quiet way without an excessive amount of interference. And maybe there are some just important but in a way quite boring things that you need to consider, not just in an organizational sense. It might be something to do with your health or diet, or something you want to make sure that it's all in order, and a bit of quiet would be something you would, I think, very much appreciate. Now, there are a couple of aspects which need to be mentioned, and those two aspects in particular are Mars semi-square Jupiter and Venus square Jupiter. And you could regard those aspects as distractors. And the Mars semi-square Jupiter, which is which is exact today, and I suspect that Mars semi-square Jupiter, all things being equal, is probably going to be felt more if you're in Australia or New Zealand than if you're in the Americas. So that might just emphasize what I was saying about Australian Pisceans or New Zealander Pisceans. But still, that Mars semi-square Jupiter, it's still there today, wherever you are. And so, Jupiter is your ruler. Mars is but Mars semi-square is, I would have said, an irritant. Someone is just irritating you, and almost perhaps trying to bait you. And I think the best response is to not respond. The best response is no response. And don't rise to the bait, and let things pass. And as a Piscean, that's something you're very good at. Just accepting that the tide changes. There can be turbulence, Mars semi-square Jupiter, going through the turbulence. If you don't stop as you swim through the turbulence, you should be okay. And then another aspect we have is Venus semi-square Jupiter. Now, that Venus semi-square Jupiter should be okay. It should work in your favor. Now, one thing about Jupiter, I was just mentioning this to Sagittarius, who of course Sagittarius also has Jupiter as their ruler, is that Jupiter has been in quite a weak position recently. It's been peregrine. It has no dignity. It's in its detriment in Gemini. It's retrograde. But Jupiter is at 12 degrees Gemini, New York time at noon today. So it's going backwards, remember. So it's going back into an earlier part of Gemini. So I think it's a part of Gemini between 6 and 12. I think it's 6 is right. It's difficult to remember these term boundaries, but term is a minor dignity. And the terms of Jupiter are between 6 and 12 Gemini, at least the Egyptian terms. And there are another type of terms, the Chaldean terms. But so 6 and 12 Gemini. And so Jupiter is moving back into its own terms. And so Jupiter, having been very weak, is kind of hitting peak weakness now, and today it moves into its terms, and so it suddenly has strength. And then Jupiter receives an aspect from Venus in Pisces. So Venus in Pisces, Venus obviously is exalted in Pisces, Venus is in your sign, and so that Venus square Jupiter, I would regard that as being reassuring, very reassuring. After a period of difficulty, turbulence, perhaps also a feeling of underlying weakness, you can actually find a place for yourself. And that's important, because when Jupiter moves into its terms, it finally has found somewhere where it feels comfortable. And so Venus square Jupiter can really intensify that. And in fact, intensity is the wrong word. It can just strengthen it, because we don't want intensity right now. We just want to feel relaxed. And so if you feel recently there hasn't been much relaxation, there has been a lot of stress, I think that Venus square Jupiter moving back into its terms can be really, really helpful. But just don't allow anything which is a bother, which is trying to aggravate you. Don't allow it to get under your skin. Just keep swimming and find your place. And perhaps your place is in the ocean, but your place is that little part of your symbolic ocean where you feel completely comfortable. And I think that's something you can find. So actually, Pisces, it can be a very good day, and it can be a very reassuring day as well. And now I want to consider things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I ask the question, what is Tuesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 43, which is breakthrough. And breakthrough sounds good. It sounds as if there's been a period of tension and we're able to make that breakthrough. And so that sounds good. But what it's really talking about is a call for action. We really do feel that we actually have to do something. And it might also feel that if we don't do something, then something bad could happen. And we're perhaps aware of a disintegrating situation, something which appears to be moving from bad to worse. And we're already getting the signs. Perhaps we've already seen other people suffering and other people being damaged by something, and we don't want to get damaged as well. So what do? Well, we have to flee, and fleeing can be one aspect of this hexagram, the breakthrough. Yet the bottom line moves, and only the bottom line moves. And the bottom line represents the toes. Now this hexagram, the lines, I suppose with any hexagram, and I suppose if you're concerned about the physical side of things, you could say that the top line represents the head, and the bottom line represents the feet or even the toes. And so with the bottom line moving, you have perhaps the image of the foot trying to move forward. We're trying to make that first move. And the I Ching is suggesting that we shouldn't make that move, that we're just not up to it. There's even in one translation, in the Greg Wincook translation, he even talks about damaging one's foot. So do look after your feet, because that's where the movement is. And so, make sure you're wearing, whatever you're doing, don't do anything dangerous, wear a good pair of shoes, don't slip, all the usual advice about looking after your feet. But taking a big move or making a big move is not necessarily advisable, because things could go wrong, and we just need to perhaps accept that we're not up to the task. So what does that mean if we feel that we have to make a move, that if we don't make a move, things could move from bad to worse? Well, what do we do then? Well, I suppose to an extent it depends on the situation. Of course, if you're in the middle of a fire zone, of course you've got to move. But if it's just a general feeling that you just have to do something and you're not entirely sure, you're a vague aware of danger, maybe there's a suggestion that you should hold off for a little, just a bit, because perhaps you're not strong enough. But maybe in the end you will have to make that move, because this hexagram 43 is about fleeing. It is about flight, or it can be. And so with that moving hexagram, we move to, obviously with that moving line, we move to a second hexagram, and that is hexagram number 28, which is the preponderance of the great. We haven't had this hexagram for a bit of time, and the preponderance of a great represents a heavy object. You can see heavy object, 4 unbroken lines in the middle, and top and bottom lines broken, so the handles are not very strong. And so it's really difficult picking up this object. And this may relate back to the previous hexagram. The previous hexagram was saying, don't advance. You're not strong enough. Not yet. But at some stage, with moving to the preponderance of a great, it does seem that we do have to take some kind of burden. It's a heavy burden, and I'm not saying it's a literal burden. I'm not advocating that you pick up a huge weight and destroy your back. That's not what I'm suggesting. But it's something that is difficult, and it's a situation where you probably can see things through. But you've just got to keep moving. When you've got this big burden, if you just stop, then this burden will just weigh you down and you won't get anywhere. It will drag you down even. So preponderance of a great, perhaps it's the overall hexagram is a situation where, and with its movement, is that you are preparing to take a big responsibility, but you need to get your timing right. To begin with, you may not be up to the challenge, so you have to wait and see how things pan out and just not make your move until you're very sure that you are sufficiently strong. Now, what I want to do now is I want to just look a bit more at the astrology of today. I mean, I do want to look at Meghan in a moment, but there are a couple of things to be said about today's astrology. And I have noticed, I looked at what the markets are doing. I'm actually recording this on Monday morning, and so I was looking at the markets, and the markets are all over the place. I mean, down. I know that cryptocurrencies are going down. I thought that the Nasdaq was down. I don't know what they're like now, but there's clearly a lot of pressure in the markets, and it's to do with worries. I think worries about bond yields going up, and there isn't much optimism around. Now, just remember, I'm not making any financial predictions here. I'm just observing what I can see. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. I suppose I should sort of make the effort. And part of my thesis about what's happening financially relates to the Jupiter-Saturn square, the fact that we had this Jupiter-Saturn square, I think, on Christmas Eve, and Jupiter-Saturn square is very much about the business cycle, and so when you have a Jupiter-Saturn square, it's a crisis moment in the business cycle. I mean, I think this Jupiter-Saturn square, it's a first quarter Jupiter-Saturn square. We had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on in the end of 2020. It may be a crisis, it may be difficult at the time. My feeling is that it's not as bad as it looks from a sort of longer term perspective. I mean, Jupiter does go into Cancer, into its exaltation, into the sign of its exaltation, I think at the beginning of June. And this first quarter Jupiter-Saturn square, for like 5 years or so after the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, in previous decades, in previous 20-year periods, like the mid-80s or the mid-60s, is often a time of economic growth and expansion. Maybe not this time round, but I think perhaps there's a tendency to be a little bit too negative. I mean, I may be wrong. Remember, this is for entertainment purposes only. And we really do need to consider the state of Jupiter. Now, as I was telling some of the signs, Jupiter is very weak at the moment. Jupiter is, it is retrograde. It's in Gemini, which is the sign of its detriment because it rules Sagittarius. It's also at the moment peregrine. It has no dignity. So dignity, you could dignity in terms of it's not in its own sign, it's not in its own exaltation, it's not in its own triplicity. In other words, it doesn't have rulership over the Aries element because it's in Gemini. It's not in its term, it's not in its face. But in terms of the term, today Jupiter does move into its own term. So Jupiter goes retrograde past 12 degrees Gemini into its own term. So Jupiter gets some dignity today. And I think that may represent potentially a time of some kind of recovery. And I suppose we look at the markets, falling apart, at least where they were when I last looked at them. But I think that this Jupiter in moving into its own term may create a little bit of optimism. But we'll have to see. So that's one thing I wanted to say about today. And just remember, I'm not giving any sort of financial advice, and it may be that it had nothing to do with the markets. But still, Jupiter moving into Gemini, moving into its own term, should perhaps provide a little bit of relief. Perhaps we can just see a possibility when recently things have just been getting more and more difficult. And then another thing about today is the fact that we have this Mars semisquare Jupiter, and which I mentioned, and there is Mars and there is Jupiter. But we also have Venus square Jupiter and Venus sesquiquadrate Mars. So there is a big build-up today, and I think that Venus-Mars-Jupiter together may suggest that it's quite an action-orientated day, quite a tense day. And if we look at this from a perspective of a 90-degree dial, so here's a 90-degree dial. In fact, that's the 45-degree dial. Let's go to the 90-degree dial. If we go to the 90-degree dial, remember, 90-degree dial. Sorry to keep repeating this, but I feel I just have to make sure everyone can understand this 90-degree dial. The 90-degree dial is a fourth harmonic chart. And basically a conjunction, a square and an opposition are shown as conjunction, and a semisquare and a sesquiquadrate are shown as an opposition. So there is Venus square Jupiter shown as a conjunction. I know they're in square, and there is the opposition to Mars. I mean, it's because Mars is semisquare Jupiter and it's sesquiquadrate Venus. So that shows the kind of tension that we're dealing with at the moment, and it is really quite stressful, and so it might be quite a heavy day, and there is a lot of action. And if you look at the United States chart, this is the one chart I wanted to look at. There's the USA's chart. The USA has its ascendant at 1221 Sagittarius, assuming that we take the view that America was born at 510 5:10 p.m. I don't know. It's very difficult to know when the Declaration of Independence really came into being, but astrologers have used this chart, and it does seem to work quite well. And if we compare the United States' chart with what's actually happening today, you can see that there is some action. So Jupiter now is very close to the United States' descendant, and Jupiter, I suppose, represents the countries that could represent the country's enemies. It represents foreign policy, what's happening in a sort of global perspective. But it's not just the fact that Jupiter is on the descendant. Venus is squaring the United States' descendant, and also Mars has just made a semi-square to the United States' descendant. So, if you like, it's all coming together. And I wonder, what happens, if anything, to America over the next couple of days with Jupiter crossing a descendant. As I said, Jupiter has already crossed a descendant very recently, over the last week. But Mars and Venus are bringing it all up again. They're refocusing it. So I thought I would mention that. And yeah, I think it could be quite a hectic day because of these aspects involving Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. I now want to finish off by looking at Meghan. And one thing I didn't mention about Meghan. So here's Meghan's chart, and Meghan has her ascendant at 2417 Cancer, and there has been a full moon. There was a full moon over the weekend. When was the full moon? In fact, the full moon was yesterday. Could be early today, again, depending on your time zone. But if you compare Meghan with the full moon, you can see how she has been really hit by it. Her ascendant at 2417 Cancer, and the moon on her ascendant, and Mars retrograding backwards towards her ascendant. We have a Sun-Mars opposition coming up, which again is on her ascendant. So this is a really difficult time for her. I would have said she is under pressure. And it's a full moon. She's seeing things for how they really are. So I think she's probably getting a big dose of reality at the moment, and I think she's becoming probably increasingly angry. I think that is a real possibility. And look at Pluto. Pluto is at 1 degree 28 Aquarius. And so Pluto is closing in on her south node and closing in on the opposition of her north node. And, I do wonder about Meghan, and I wonder about this issue of originality, because I was looking at what people say about this show she's got, With Love, Meghan. And, a lot of people were saying how unoriginal it was, how it was 20 years old, out of date, how she's basically doing what other people did a long time ago. And I think one commentator called it trite. And so why is that? Why would she do that? I don't get that. Well, of course I do get that, but what in her chart makes her get involved with something which is somewhat hackneyed, somewhat trite? It should have been, it's been done before. And I've been thinking about it, and I do think it is something to do with her south node. I think her south node is a real problem, and I think the south node may actually be the answer to one of the answers for understanding Meghan's chart, because she's got the north node in Aries, north node in Leo in the first house. This is someone who is supposed to be maybe an innovator. It's in Leo. It's conjunct Mercury. It's quite close to the Sun. Someone who is prepared to take the lead, and it's in a fire sign. Fire is supposed to be able to make connections, be able to understand, what is the right thing to be doing. But what is messing her up? And I do think it's that south node, and I think the south node is the line of least resistance. So the line of least resistance is putting too much focus on other people, doing what other people want. Now that might sound not at all what she is like, but she might think that she's always trying to be in control, giving orders and whatever. But she's always thinking perhaps about acceptance, and the fact that she put so much effort into marrying Harry. Of course, she shouldn't have married Harry. She shouldn't have been so focused on finding a relationship. The obsessive way in which she looked for a partner was out of keeping with her own destiny. This was something she should not have been doing, and so I think it's her south node has messed her up, actually. And maybe in terms of this cooking show, which a lot of people have said is unoriginal, she was perhaps trying too hard to please, trying to be too logical about it. And south node in Aquarius, and there was perhaps no real inspiration there, no real connectedness there. So that's certainly a possibility. And with Pluto on her south node, it's all coming together. And it might also be connected with that moon conjunct Saturn. That moon conjunct Saturn is very close, and it is very controlling, and it's in Libra. So Libra tries to be balanced, tries to be in harmony with everything, tries to harmonize with what she thinks other people want, and so that moon conjunct Saturn might be a problem, and it's just too close, that conjunction between Moon and Saturn. I mean, it's a nice Saturn in Libra, and it allows her to be successful. But I'm just thinking might be just in her attempts to control, in her attempts to make everything just right, she's losing touch with actually who she is. So I don't know. Those are just some thoughts about Meghan, and I suppose what I wanted to say really is that this full moon is really having a big impact on her. And then this show With Love, Meghan, which I have no interest in, and this is just an exercise in electional astrology. And in fact, astrologically, she made a good decision. I mean, I don't know whether she was consulting an astrologer. She probably wasn't, but it was quite a good decision. So if we look at the original time, so this is With Love, Meghan for March the 4th. But if we look at the original time, which was going to be January the 15th, 2025. So if we looked at the original time, I believe I've never watched. I don't think I've watched someone else's Netflix years ago, but I don't know anything about Netflix. But I believe that when a show comes on, it's accessible at midnight Pacific time. So this is, I believe, the chart of when With Love, Meghan was scheduled. And I think that there are problems with this chart. And the moon's in Leo, and the moon is, you can see that it's just separating from a sextile to Jupiter. So the moon, as far as I can see, it's void of course. In other words, the moon has made its last major aspect with a traditional planet. I don't count Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in whether or not something is void of course. So the moon is void of course. That, of course, is not a great time to be launching something. And additionally, look at Mars. No. So Mars is retrograde. So that's actually let's get the Placidus cusps for that. Make that better. So so the moon would have been in the 10th, but Mars. Okay, you might think, well, Mars on the midheaven would have been good, but Mars retrograde in Cancer on the midheaven, I don't think this would have worked at all. I think this would have got attention, but I think it would have been negative attention, and the Sun was applying to the opposition of Mars, and also it's taken place just on a full moon. You shouldn't really do something just after a full moon. You kind of want to do it just after a new moon. That would have been better. So I think that she made the right decision not to screen this thing to start this show, which is clearly very important to her, on January the 15th. Instead, she went for March the 4th. So if we change that to March the 4th, we get a different picture. By the way, it's midnight. I think it's midnight Los Angeles time, which of course I'm going for. So March the 4th, I would have said, is in some respects a better day, and a lot rests on Venus. So Venus is retrograde. Now, Venus being retrograde is clearly not a good thing. I mean, if you have got a show to do with house and gardens and beauty and aesthetics, you don't want Venus to be retrograde. And you don't want Venus to be in Aries, because Venus is in its detriment in Aries. So on the surface, you could say, well, March the 4th looks even worse. But on the other hand, the Sun is in Pisces. So the Sun is in mutual reception with Venus by exaltation. So the position of Venus is not actually quite as bad as it seems. And it may actually be quite good. I think it's very important not to ignore mutual receptions in astrology, even by exaltation. And then look at the moon. The moon is in at 13 Taurus. You could say, well, okay, that's moving towards a sextile with America's sun. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But the moon is making a sextile to the sun. So the sun is at 14 Pisces, and the moon sextile sun is it's nice having moon sextile sun. So, that is to be welcomed. Okay, it's not great that you've got the South Node in the 10th house. Will it do her reputation any good? I really don't know. And then there is the question of, how does this fit in with Meghan's horoscope? What's happening to her at the time of the release. So here's Meghan, and so we've got Meghan's chart in the middle, and we have got the outer wheel. We've got the positions for sort of midnight, March the 4th, 2020, 2025. So Venus is at 10:44 Aries. It is retrograde, but it is in mutual reception to the Sun. And Venus is actually right on her midheaven. She's got her midheaven at 11:48 Aries. So she's got Venus on her midheaven. And you could say, well, that's quite good, having Venus in mutual reception to the Sun on her midheaven. I think if Venus had not been in mutual reception to the Sun, that would not have been good. But I think that might make things a bit easier for her. And so that Venus is there. Venus is also square Mars, her Mars. So she's got her Mars at 11:27. I mean, her Mars square Venus is such an important part of who she is. Sorry, not Mars square Venus. I mean, Mars square the midheaven. I mean, there's something about her that is just too pushy, and she doesn't, I don't know, there's something discordant about it, and I don't think Harry helps. I think Harry, to an extent, represent that Mars, but Venus is square Mars, so there could be a bit of a problem there. Now, I'm certainly not saying or suggesting that this series is going to be a success. You can't tell success just by looking at a horoscope, but all I'm just pointing out is that in terms of March the 4th is a better day than January the 15th to do the first show, to start screening this With Love, Meghan. I still think that Venus retrograde, I don't know, what do you think? I think that Venus retrograde is still a bit of a problem, but yeah, I think it's better than January the 15th, but I don't think this guarantees success by any means. I mean, many people are sort of saying it's definitely going to fail. I don't know. I don't know anything about this. It's also nice that there's moon sextile sun. So would an astrologer have chosen that date? March the 4th as an alternative? Quite possibly. If there'd perhaps been a limited window, an astrologer might have said, well, given all the possibilities, that might have been the best day to go for. But probably in terms of scheduling, Meghan might not have had a lot of choice about when to launch her show. Anyway, that's enough on Meghan. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. And I will talk to you again tomorrow.